Lord, open our ears as we listen for your word. We long to know you, to understand life, and to be changed. Examine us, transform us. Amen. How many people here read the directions before you start doing something? How many people here get made fun of for reading the directions before you start doing something? Yeah. How many people here have ever gone to IKEA, though? Right? Have you ever put something together from IKEA? Okay, there are directions, but they're directions without any words. And so they're helpful, but if you get something large enough, I guarantee you there will be a point where you realize you have to go backwards because you used a slightly wrong piece or a different screw than what is needed. And so directions are helpful. Sometimes they require us to work a little bit to understand them. If you follow the advice of your medical professionals, then you would go to class for several weeks. You'll go to many appointments and checkups. You'll pack a bag. You'll lay out a route. You'll have a timer and a time specified. You'll feel prepared, scared, but ready to go. And then the day will come and the time will be now, and you'll follow everything that you've learned, and at the end of it all, this little baby, a little piece of life will be handed to you, and all of the professionals will say, "See ya." You'll carry that car seat, right? And you put it in the car for the first time, and you'll start freaking out in your mind. Like you knew everybody was a terrible driver, but you didn't realize how bad everybody was. You'll start thinking things like, I'm not ready for this. I'm not prepared. I'm not up to this task. This is too big. This is too hard. It's too difficult. This is near impossible for me. How can I protect this baby? I'm going to fail in raising this child. One of the hardest, most difficult things to do in life is to raise a child, because they don't come with instruction manuals, not even the ones without words. And they aren't all the same. And the world has so much influence over them, things that are outside of our control, so much power in their lives. Now Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew at this point, Jesus has been teaching his disciples and those who can hear him for a little while now. And at the end of this sermon in Matthew, he gives us some tough instructions. If we remember, throughout this sermon, he taught us what it means to be blessed, not just here and now, but future blessings as well. He taught us a model of how to pray and to live based on that prayer. And now he's giving us some tough instructions for our lives. And I feel like each one builds on what is presented before it. And they start hard, and they move to difficult, and then it ends with something that seems near impossible. And all of this is to prepare us for life as Christ followers. And so we're going to walk through these instructions. And we start with the hard. Jesus says at the beginning of chapter 7, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is still in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." Here's the thing. We all judge. And every one of us is judged. It's almost as automatic as breathing. And Jesus knows this. He knows his followers. He knows us. He just told us a chapter ago that God knows what is on our hearts before we say it. And he's telling us to stop using these judgments to make assumptions and to impact our relationships. A deeper translation is not really judgment, but condemnation. Working Preacher encourages us to read this text as, quote, "Do not go on condemning to hell." Because to condemn someone to hell means that you've made a judgment and you've acted upon it. You've said they're not worthy. They're not worthy of your time, of God's grace. They're not worthy of relationship. And this translation addresses various situations involving other people. It addresses conflict, fear of outsiders, intolerance of difference, prejudice, disdain, anger. In such situations, people can write others off as beyond redemption, outside of God's grace, and consign them to hell. This command from Jesus forbids the arrogance of denying mercy, even dignity to another, because we, as followers of Jesus, have no right to declare that someone is beyond God's mercy. That's hard. Those judgments are automatic, but it's really hard not to act upon them, not to let them impact our daily lives, to impact our relationships, to assume that we know why another person acted or said what they did. And Jesus doesn't end there. He adds this another hard one on here, and it's confusing. It's very confusing. The next thing that Jesus says after not judging is, "Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you." This is the part of the text that gave me the hardest time this week. I wanted to get a good explanation of this part of the text. There's not a whole lot written about it. People like to write about the do not judge part. They like to write about what comes next. We kind of skip over this sentence or two. There's not a bunch there. And what I did find, it seems like a lot of people use this to contradict Jesus' first command to not judge. People like to read this as, I possess something holy, and then I get to decide who's swine or dogs and whether or not I can dispense that holiness to them. That sounds an awful lot like trying to take a speck out of someone's eye while you still got a log in yours. But I think this one, I believe this one is an internal action as well. As with the judgment of others, it's decisions that we make inside whether to live and act on those judgments. When Jesus tells us not to throw the holy to the dogs, we need to ask, who are the dogs and what is holy? So I think when we start looking internally, we start to recognize that we all can be dogs and the swine. We all can hear and see and believe the goodness of God and then twist the gospel to serve only ourselves and in the process trample on the good news. Christ is warning us about our own desires and to not become our lowest selves, the judgmental, self-serving swine. Not serving self and not judging, condemning, and acting on judgments, those are hard things to do. But I think Jesus is just getting started, and he starts challenging us a little further. Because we're going to move from what is hard to what is difficult. Because something that is difficult requires us to work for it. It's not entirely internal or constant reminding. It requires action outside of ourselves. And so Jesus is getting our mind in the right state so that we can move outside of ourselves. And so he continues, ask and it will be given to you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? This line right here, if you then, who are evil, always stands out to me. Because the people that Jesus is preaching to, it says that he went up on the mountain and his disciples followed him. These are people who have committed their lives already to following him. It's them and whomever else is near enough to hear. But what we hear is that it's his disciples that came with him. And right here at the end of this message, he turns to them and says, "You then, who are evil." Jesus is confronting us where we are with those judgments that we make, with those actions that we take to the detriment of others. And he's telling us to stop. When he says, if we ask, it'll be given. If we search, we will find. It seems easy enough because we really like to be given things, don't we? What's the phrase? If it's free, I'll take 3, right? We love that. We shouldn't have a problem asking. But do we really think that God cares about the asks most of us make? Do you think God cares about the Browns making the playoffs? Yeah, there we go. We got one yeah there. You're raising her well, I guess. But do we really think that God cares about what parking spot we get at the grocery store, especially when it's raining? We ask for these things that revolve around us. But here Christ is challenging us to see something bigger. Our asks and our searching for should be for something bigger because God already provides what is needed. So we should be asking and searching for opportunities to serve and to give so that others can receive and find. And then, difficult still, he commands us what is known as the golden rule. Do we know what the golden rule is? Do unto others as you would have them do to you. In everything, I like the NRSV translation of this. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophet. The entirety, Jesus is saying the entirety of the law can be found in this one sentence. It calls us into action and into service for others. In everything. Every day, every moment, every action, do to others as we would want others to treat us. Now, we don't want to be condemned to hell. We don't want people to treat us like our worst moments. We don't want to be marginalized, used, and abused. We want goodness and graciousness and forgiveness. We want people to have empathy and sympathy. When we have a bad day, we want people to understand the way the world is treating us and not make a judgment about us. So show that. As the song says, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Not by our judgment, by our love. And so in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. And Jesus continues and pushes us to live a life that isn't like everyone else's. And he tells us to follow his path. In verse 13 we read, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." He knows the sayings he is preaching are hard and difficult, and yet it is still where we are called to go. It's much easier to sit and be comfortable than to stand when called and serve. It's much easier to make judgments about others and not enter into relationship than to be vulnerable enough to enter into a relationship, to share of yourself so that you can learn about someone else. And after all of his preaching, Jesus tells us to do something. To live in a way that seems like it's just too much. I mean, it makes perfect sense, and yet when we actually do it, it's too much work, it's too hard, it's too difficult, too uncomfortable, we don't feel ready, and we say it's near impossible. Well, let someone else do it. Jesus ends this entire message with the story about two men. He says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." I've been to New Orleans a couple of times after Hurricane Katrina to help out in the Ninth Ward, the lower and upper Ninth Ward. I don't know if you've ever been to New Orleans. Has anyone ever been there? It really is below sea level. There are walls that are holding water back so that people can live. And when you're there and you're helping out, obviously you have the question of, why would you live here? Right? It's an easy question for an outsider. It's an easy question for somebody who didn't grow up on that street, whose grandmother didn't own the house on the corner, whose uncle didn't live down the road, whose family didn't run the market. For someone who has no roots, no depth, no history, it seems like, why would you build your house on sand? Because it's tough. It's tough to move your foundation. In this world where we are tempted by so many things, when there is so much influence outside of the good news that guides us, sometimes it's just easier to put your foundation in sand. It's the wide path. But Jesus is telling us not to take that way, but to enter through the narrow gate, to follow these words and to act on them. It's nicer to stay at home on Thursday evenings than it is to come into the church basement and pack bags for kids who live in food insecure homes. It's nicer to stay home for a weekend than it is to go and serve with Impact Massillon. It's easier. That is, until you do it. Because once you enter into that narrow gate and find yourself on that hard road, you'll see that there are others there to help you along, to serve alongside you, to celebrate with you, to be family in Christ. There are many things in life that seem hard, that seem difficult, and some that seem near impossible. But like raising a child, we recognize that we're not alone. We have a support group. We're part of a body. Jesus wasn't preaching to a single person. He was preaching to his disciples and those who could hear. No one was alone in their hearing or in their acting on these words. And beyond ourselves, we have the Holy Spirit who can guide us on our path. So I pray that this week, because we're going to jump ahead a couple of chapters in a minute, starting next week. But I pray that this week you go back and you read these words from Jesus again, that you sit with them, wrestle with them, let them confront the parts of you that need to change and to follow the hard, the difficult, and the near impossible of being true Christ followers. Because I believe together we can do it. Amen.